Hey guys, Ragnar54 here, and welcome back to another RuneScape video. So I finally got around to buying a Bow of the Last Guardian recently, and I was looking for a good place to learn how to use it and kind of get back into ranged, and Next turned out to be quite a good place to do that. So I thought I'd also make a guide on how I've been approaching the fight and how you guys can get really fast kills. So a couple disclaimers, this is again going to be a really advanced guide aimed at those players who already have kind of a best in slot setup, like I said, a Bow of the Last Guardian, ECB, EOF, that kind of thing. And it's really going to be aimed towards people who are trying to get the fastest kill times kind of possible in game consistently. And I do have to say that I have spent a lot fewer hours at Nex recently with this setup compared to the other bosses that I've made guides on. So I'm going to have to do a little bit more kind of hand waving because I'm not really as much of an expert as I'd like to be, but I still think that I can give you guys a lot of value in this guide. I'm just maybe not going to get everything 100% correct, but I'm going to try my best. So if you do notice anything that's wrong, please just leave a comment so that others can see that. Okay, so for the setup, there's a few kind of non-standard things. The main one is probably Dominion Tower. You'll notice that I have Dominion Mines in my preset. These are really useful, and I definitely recommend having them for this. The Swift Gloves are also from Dominion Tower. They're a lot less required. You don't really need them, but if you have mines, you probably almost have them unlocked anyway, so I'd recommend just going and spending like 5 or 10 minutes unlocking those because it makes it a lot more fun. The Whip in my inventory is a clear-headed switch. I definitely recommend getting one of these. It's a really cheap perk. That's why I just threw it on a whip because it's like 70k. You can have this on any piece of equipment as long as it's not the same piece of armor that has crackling on it, because we're going to try to stall crackling between kills. I have expensive spices in my inventory, which is a reward from like a super beginner level quest, but it's actually pretty useful here, so if somehow you haven't done that like 5-minute quest, I'd recommend going and getting that. Of course, when you're doing Next, you want the Stone of Jas boost, because it's just free DPS, so don't forget to do that. One other thing I would recommend having is the enchantment on your Stalker's Ring. I can't remember what that's called, but if you just wiki it, you'll be able to find it. Would definitely recommend having that. It's not that expensive, and it does increase your DPS a good bit. We're going to be using a Shadow Nihil here instead of like a Reaver or a Ripper or something like that. And then for relics, I'm going to be using Blessing of Het, which is not really required, but it is really useful since we're essentially going to be spam eating during the entire fight. And then the other two relics I'm using are Conservation of Energy and Fury of the Small. So one more super weird kind of unfortunate thing is we are going to have to use a cosmetic override on our bow. I know it sucks because this bow looks awesome and costs a lot of money, but unfortunately Jagex has made it so that certain slow hitting abilities actually go through one tick earlier if you have a blowpipe or a bone blowpipe as your cosmetic override. It has something to do with like the animation of the ability, but regardless, the moral of the story is that you need to buy a blowpipe or a bone blowpipe and use a keepsake key to override your bow, because if you don't do this, then you're going to be using Greco on the minions and then waiting for like a million years for the damage to actually go through, and then another million years for the ECB damage to go through. So you really want to use this override because it will make everything just a lot smoother, and you'll see that in this guide if you compare it to not having to override yourself. Okay, so some of the other more standard setup stuff, I'm not going to go through everything. I just have regular best in slot perks. You can look at my inventory for the more standard stuff. You don't need 3 rune pouches. You can just be on Lunars and have runes for Disruption Shield. You don't need any like enhanced Nightmare Gauntlets or anything like that. You don't need the hard mode Zup Cape. You can just have the ranged one. I have Blackstone arrows equipped in my preset because we'll use those first for the debuff, and then in my quiver I have full arrows selected and Wen arrows as my secondary. And then in my EOFs I have the ECB EOF equipped and a Dark Bow EOF in my inventory. Okay, so let's get into the fight. Nex is definitely one of those bosses where how well the first phase goes really affects the second phase and the third phase and so on. So you really want to be doing everything you can to make sure you're doing everything correctly from the beginning. And unfortunately, that kind of starts with your banking. So obviously banking is always important in terms of increasing your kills per hour at any boss, but it's kind of disproportionately important here because we want to have crackling go off during every single P1. And if you don't want to leave that up to chance, then what you have to do is stay in combat between your kills. This is pretty simple, but you just have to kind of think about it. I know nowadays with the free Adrenaline stalling, a lot of us don't really even think about what it is to be in combat or out of combat anymore. So you just want to make sure to use some defensive abilities after you kill Nex and while you're banking, like Surge and Anticipation and stuff like that, so that you stay in combat. Personally, what I do is I use an Anticipation as I'm picking up my loot, and then I teleport to wars, immediately spam Surge toward the Adrenaline crystals. You don't need to touch the altar at all. You can just sip some of your Restore Potion. It's basically free, and you don't need to reset any cooldowns, so you can go immediately toward the Adrenaline crystal. Channeling Adrenaline does keep you in combat, so you don't need to worry about that. I go into the next bank, and then re-enter my instance and immediately Surge again. And then I drop down into the arena and Surge one more time. And then as the timer for the boss kill starts to appear, you can use one more defensive. I like to use Preparation since I'm not going to use that at all during this fight. So I know that might sound a little bit annoying, but it really is worth it to get that extra crackling proc on P1. You don't have to do this, of course. You can try it without this, and of course, many kills I accidentally drop combat, or I have to go do something in real life between kills or something like that. It's totally fine, but you will notice a big difference on how smooth the rest of your kill goes, depending on how much RNG you get with that crackling on P1 if you're not stalling it. All right, so let's get into phase 1. I like to stand right on this square. It gives me line of sight toward Fumus, and I can still attack Nex. So as she's spawning your minions, you want to equip your clear-headed switch and use Anticipation right when the timer hits 9 seconds. Then you want to switch back to your bow, throw down your Vuln Bomb, and use your ECB EOF spec. This should be right about when the fight starts, so you want to start spam clicking on Nex and use an auto into BolG spec. So this should apply the Blackstone arrows effect, and after this you can switch to your quiver, which as I said has full arrows selected. You technically can switch to the quiver for your BolG spec, so you get the boosted damage, but also your first auto can splash since no BSAs are applied yet, and it's not that big of a DPS difference, so I just keep my Blackstone arrows equipped until after my BolG spec, and then I put on my quiver for the next ability. One other thing regarding full arrows in this fight is that you may know that they give a accuracy debuff, and the full setup for this boss puts you right above 100% accuracy, so if you do have that debuff, then you don't really have 100% accuracy. So you only want to use full arrows when you're using abilities that have boosted accuracy, like Snipe with Nightmare Gauntlets, any like weapon special attacks and that sort of thing. So you'll notice throughout the fight that we do arrow switching based on what kind of ability we're using. Okay, so anyway, after the BolG spec on P1, you want to throw off a rapid fire and then get ready to attack Fumus. So be kind of carefully watching Nex's health, and as it gets around like 165k, you want to start spam clicking on Fumus. And it won't actually let you target the minion until Nex's face, so you can spam click as early as you want. You just want to be a little bit careful of running too early, because then you might break the line of sight with you and Nex, and that will cancel your rapid fire if you get too far out of sight. So for this minion, all you really need to do is Greco it. You can also throw a Vuln as you're Grecoing, and that does help it be more consistent. I found that if you have all the correct boosts, it's like a 90+% chance that Fumus dies just from one Greco, because you're also going to get some BolG procs on there and the ECB damage, of course. But on the times that he doesn't die, he has like 100 or 200 HP, which is really infuriating. So if you want to spend the extra effort and money throwing a Vuln Bomb, that will get you to, I believe it's 100% chance that he dies, or at least I've never seen a kill where I Vulned and he didn't die from the Greco. But regardless of if you Vuln or not, you want to Greco and then wait 1 tick after you Greco to target cycle back to Nex. This is the amount of time that it'll take the ECB damage to actually go off, and if you target cycle too early, Fumus won't be your target anymore, and even though your Greco damage might go through, the ECB damage does not, and he's going to be stuck on like 2k HP. Like I said earlier, this is the main reason we're using a blowpipe override, so that this damage happens a little bit earlier, so you don't just have to sit there waiting for the minion to die before target cycling back to Nex. Okay, so this is the first arrow swap because we're going to be using an ability that does not have any sort of boosted accuracy. Now, you don't have to do this, and I didn't do this for a long time, but you will occasionally splash if you keep using your full arrows, and trust me, that is like the worst thing ever, and honestly, it just makes you want to teleport. So I'd recommend from the beginning trying to switch to your Wen arrows for this ability, because I did not know this for like the first several hours I was doing next, and it was very infuriating. So again, that's one tick after your Greco on Fumus. You want to click or target cycle back on next and use a fragmentation shot with when arrows. All right, so I know that was a lot, but if you actually think about it, it's really only like 3 abilities or 4 abilities. So I know I said a lot about it, but once you actually go here and try it out yourself, you'll see it's really not that hard. And that's all of phase 1. Okay, so going into phase 2, this is going to be a very fast phase because nobody likes shadow phase. Nobody likes getting the bleed. So you just want to get this over with as soon as you possibly can. Now, there's a couple things coming out of P1 that are going to affect how well this phase goes. We have our BolG spec running, which means that every 4th arrow we shoot is going to be doubled. Now, we're going to be using a dark bow on this phase, so ideally we trigger BolG spec on this dark bow. But as you may be able to guess, that's really just going to depend on how many BolG specs you have. And because P1 is kind of just RNG dependent on how many rapid fire hits went off, you're not going to get this every kill, and it kind of sucks when you don't, but when you do, it's really cool. So if you take a look at the BolG stacks you have after Grecoing Fumus, you'll see what I mean. So we can actually tell if our Debo is going to proc the BolG spec if we look at the number of BolG stacks we have after Grecoing Fumus. So as a little spoiler, what we're going to do on P2 is auto Debo. So that means we're going to get the auto attack, which is 1, and the Debo, which is 2. So if you have 1 BolG stack coming into P2, then that means that your second Debo hit will proc the BolG spec, which is great. If you have 2 stacks, that means the first Debo hit will proc the BolG spec, which is also great. If you have 3 stacks, that means the auto attack is going to proc it, which is like okay, but not the best. And 0 stacks is really the worst situation to be in because nothing is going to proc it, and you're going to have to use another ability. Now, like I said, this is just kind of dependent on how much damage your rapid fire P1 did, so you can't really affect this, unfortunately. But you just kind of want to keep an eye on it, and I didn't keep an eye on it for the first many hours I did this because there's just like a lot to think about, and you're not really going to be paying attention to everything that's on your screen. That's totally okay. I'm just saying this now so that after you've done a few hours, you can come back and start to focus on some more things and start to pay attention to your BolG stacks. Okay, so another thing to pay attention to on P2 is what happens when you actually use Combust on next. So going back to P1, we've Grecoed the minion, and we're waiting 1 tick for the ECB damage to go through. While you're waiting for this tick, I'd recommend clicking somewhere in the middle of the arena so that you start running back toward Nex, who presumably, unless she ran toward you during P1, is currently running toward you because you've gone around the corner and attacked Fumus. And then as you're running around after that 1 tick after the global cooldown, you click or target cycle back to Nex and use your Combust. And once you get this down, the timing is such that Nex is kind of crossing paths with you as you're running back toward her. And it's kind of RNG which direction she walks when you actually use the fragmentation shot on her. So there are some times where she just stays exactly where she was when you hit her, which is like under your character, which kind of sucks because it means she didn't walk the fragmentation shot, and it probably means you're not going to have enough damage to phase on the Debo. There's the situations where she walks either to the side or away from you, and you'll notice this because the fragmentation shot will do the double damage on its first tick. And there's the situation where she walks in the direction that you are running, which is toward the center of the arena. Now, there's another thing to take into consideration when you start this phase, and that's which direction Nex walks in when you use fragmentation shot. So you'll notice when you're running back toward the center of the arena and she's running toward you, you're going to be able to attack her and therefore phase her right about when you're on top of each other. So when you're on top of each other, she's going to walk in one of a couple directions. She can actually just stay still, which kind of sucks because she doesn't walk your fragmentation shot, and that's going to kind of screw you over for a lot of damage. She can walk either to the side or away from the center, which is great because it doubles the damage, and she's farther away from you, which I'll get into in a second. Or she can walk toward the center of the arena, which is nice for the fragmentation double damage, but is not nice because she's going to be within range to attack you. Now, once again, this is important because of how it affects the next phase in the kill. So if you phase next into blood phase before she turns the room dark, then you're going to start with a different special attack compared to if you phase her after she's made the room dark. Now, this is kind of dependent on if she gets autos off on you and how close she is to you and stuff like that. So that's why it's important to get the walk where she either walks to the side, doesn't move at all, or moves away from you, because in the one where she moves close to you, then no matter how fast you run, she's still going to be able to get an auto attack off on you. So, like I said during the P1 section, you're going to be phasing her with when arrows, but you want to immediately switch back to full arrows so you do as much damage as possible with your Debo spec. Okay, so let's go through some of the other things that happen during this phase, because even though it's really short, there's still a lot of things that are going on. You're also going to need to be ready to switch your EOFs pretty quickly, since you need to essentially EOF spec into Debo spec. So let's go through the actual rotation for this phase again real quick, and let's see what's happening. So as you phase next, she's not going to be targetable or damageable for one global cooldown. So you want to use Freedom here in order to get a little bit more adrenaline. Then you're going to switch arrows, ECB spec, switch your EOFs, and then Debo spec. I like to switch back to my ECB EOF immediately here so I don't forget, because otherwise you might accidentally Debo into the blood siphon, which really sucks. But you don't technically have to do this. And all the while you're doing this, while you click to auto attack her, while you Debo, while you're switching your arrows and EOFs, you want to be running away toward the other side of the arena. And if all of this is done correctly, you're going to be past the midway point when you actually send off your Debo. And it's after you send off the Debo that you can bladed dive diagonally toward the next minion. So after you've done a few hours of this, you'll sort of start to get an idea of how much damage you're doing based on if she walked your frag shot, if you had the BolG stacks, that sort of thing. And you'll understand whether or not you should bladed dive, because you don't want to bladed dive away if she's going to be on like 2k HP till phase HP. But if you got some good RNG, then you just kind of trust it and Debo and bladed dive away, and that should phase her. So if this did phase her, you just want to Greco the next minion. Same thing as the first minion. You can Vuln here if you want. There are situations where it can be on like 100 HP, which really sucks. And then you want to, once again, switch to when arrows and use a piercing shot on next to phase her into blood phase, right as she's coming around the corner. Just like the first phase, you're going to want to wait an extra tick for your ECB damage to go through to guarantee to kill this minion, which should be fine because that's just right about the time where Nex is finally coming around the corner and you're able to target her. Okay, so what happens if Nex does not walk to the side or away from you? Well, this means that when you are trying to auto attack her, she is going to be close enough to be within range to start her shadow phase, which is what we don't want. So if she does this, she's going to turn the whole room dark, and you just want to continue as normal, but know that you're going to start blood phase with a different special attack. Now, the last scenario to cover is the one where you got unlucky BolG stacks, and really, in most cases, it's enough to just shoot off one dazing shot. And keep in mind that in most of these cases, it's this next ability that you use that's going to get doubled. So that's why I normally use like a dazing shot. It's just like a low cooldown, fairly strong ability, and usually she's not that far off from being phased. And keep in mind you have ECB running during this, so even if a dazing shot does like 2k and then it gets doubled to 4k and then the ECB does like 2k, so it will probably do enough to phase her. If she's on like 130k or above, something probably went wrong, like you didn't get your frag shot walked or something like that, and you might have to do a dazing into a piercing or something like that. Phase 2 is also when I pop my adrenaline renewal, but it's not strictly necessary. Sometimes you just have a ton of adrenaline, like if you had some bad P1 RNG. But regardless, I usually pop my adrenaline renewal around the time when I ECB or Dark Bow. So once you phased into blood phase, you have one of two different scenarios. Either you were able to get a shadow phase skip where she did not say Embrace Darkness, or you did not skip that. So let's talk about the non-skip scenario first, because that's a lot more likely. When you do an hour after you've gotten pretty good at this, you'll probably get several shadow phase skips, but in my experience, I wasn't able to get it with any level of consistency, probably more like a 25 to 30% kind of thing. So if you did not get a skip, then she's going to do the blood siphon, which is kind of a long animation. So after you tag her with a piercing shot to start blood phase, you want to equip your shield and use divert. Sometimes you'll get extra adren from this if she's sent a ranged auto, but if not, it's nice just to get the adren from the divert in the first place. And then you put back on your full arrows, since we phased her with when arrows, and then ECB spec. And the timing for the snipe that you want to do after ECB is a little bit finicky, but it's when she starts to raise her wings. That's just something that you'll feel out after you do some more kills. But regardless, it's a snipe into rapid fire. This is also when I re-vuln, because it's the only time that she's really standing still. It's really not that different if you do end up getting a skip. You just have to kind of be on your toes and be ready for it, because there's a lot less room to kind of do nothing. So you need to immediately divert and then ECB spec right off the bat instead of waiting around to snipe. So you just ECB spec and then you click next again to auto, since you've done 2 defensives, and then rapid fire. So regardless of if you got a skip or not, when you're rapid firing, you want to kind of position yourself close to the next minion to be ready to kill the minion as soon as she phases down to 80k HP. What I like to do is Greco the minion and then bladed dive around the corner to kind of force Nex to follow me around while the Greco is actually doing the damage on the minion. It's really important to try to bring Nex around this corner for Ice Phase if you can, because you want to be able to place mines on Glacies, which is a little bit far away during Ice Phase, so you really want to get a head start during Blood Phase if you can. So much like Shadow Phase affected Blood Phase is also going to affect what special attack you start with on Ice Phase, and we really want to avoid starting with an Ice Prison. And this essentially means that you want to phase into Ice Phase after she turns you red and asks for a blood sacrifice. If you phase right after she's done a blood siphon, then the first spec on Ice Phase is going to be the Ice Prison, which just really sucks and wastes a lot of your time. So that means that if you started with a blood siphon on Blood Phase, that means you did not get a skip on P2, then you want to wait for her to turn you red to phase into Ice Phase. Even if you happen to get good RNG and you like one hit Kruer, you still want to wait an auto archer until she turns you red. And that's something you'll learn, like kind of the timing for that as you do more kills. But oftentimes what I'll do is I'll do the rapid fire and then Greco or dazing or piercing Kruer as I bladed dive around the corner. And while she's following me around the corner, I'll do one more ability on the minion, even though it probably would already die from just the Greco, depending on my RNG and BolG stacks. And then I will target Nex and phase her into Ice Phase, and that will both bring her around the corner and makes sure she gets off an extra auto so that she turns you red instead of being phased after the siphon. Now, if you do get a skip on P2, then you need to go fast on Blood Phase, because if you wait too long, she will do the Blood Siphon as her second special attack. So she'll turn you red immediately. You need to DPS as fast as you can with that rapid fire, and then Greco Kruer, wait one tick, and then immediately phase her into Ice Phase, because if you wait too long, then it's really easy to accidentally get a Blood Siphon, and then it's just not a good time. So once you've killed the minion, you want to equip your Wen arrows if you didn't already have them on, and use another fragmentation shot, hopefully walking Nex for that first tick of it. Then as you start Ice Phase, you want to use an Anticipation and another ECB spec. So positioning is really important during this phase compared to the other ones, because you need to get over to Glacies and place down your Dominion mines. So essentially the ideal is for you and Nex to both be on the straightaway on that side of the arena, so that you can just turn and surge and arrive in front of Glacies. So you want to anticipate, ECB spec, and then click Nex to get the auto as she kind of starts the phase, and then snapshot and surge over to Glacies and place your mines as you use a BolG the Last Guardian spec. If you place the mines kind of as you're using this ability, or maybe even right before, that'll give them plenty of time to turn on so that they can actually go off before you Greco Glacies, or right as you Greco Glacies. But this BolG spec, if you've done everything right, should phase the boss. And so you can immediately click onto Glacies and Greco with Wen arrows still equipped. You can equip full arrows for your BolG spec, since the Wen buff doesn't buff special attacks, and you have the boosted accuracy with the special attack, so you can just do that to get a little bit more damage. If you find that you're sometimes not quite phasing it, it is worth to do this. Otherwise, honestly, I usually just keep my when arrows on because I'm going to forget to switch them back and then splash a lot or something like that. But anyway, you want to use your when arrows to Greco Glacies, and this time you don't have to wait for the ECB damage or anything. You can just immediately, at the end of a global cooldown, target cycle or click back on next to phase her into the last phase. If you don't have Dominion Mines or you don't manage to place them, and that's probably going to happen quite a bit as you're learning because, like I said, positioning on this phase is really difficult, then you're probably going to have to either wait that one tick depending on your BolG stacks or do one more basic on Glacies. This can really make or break your kill because if you do get an ice prison here, it just sucks up a lot of your time and does a lot of damage, and your ECB has run out and all that. So you really want to try to do this phase as efficiently as possible and get that surge into mines placed down as soon as you can. So zaros phase is definitely the most improvisation out of anything because you really don't know how much adrenaline you're going to have. Sometimes your cooldowns can come into play, but generally you phase next into zaros phase with a corruption, and then you ECB again, or if you have high adren, then you want to dead shot. Usually if I'm like close to being able to dead shot, I will corruption into piercing or dazing and then dead shot. And then after that, your fragmentation shot should be just about off cooldown. And then after that, I usually ECB into another piercing into a Swift Gloves Greco, and then limitless rapid fire. So like I said, there's a lot of improvisation you can do on this phase. Essentially, your goal is to get off your bleeds, ECB, and rapid fire, and a Greco. So whichever order you can do that in best, that works. Even if you have to skip the dead shot because sometimes you're just really low adren for whatever reason, you just immediately corruption into like a frag shot or piercing shot, re-ECB and limitless rapid as soon as you can. And then you can either cancel that rapid with something like a snapshot if it's off cooldown, or even a piercing shot since the hit cap is so punishing on this phase, and then Greco as soon as that's off cooldown. Okay, so that is all the phases covered. I'm sure I left out a few small things here and there. You may have caught me using Smoke Cloud during some of the blood phases I showed, for example. It's not really like worth it, to be honest, especially when you're learning. It's lossless, of course, so there's no reason not to. But when you're learning this boss, you're gonna get a lot of stuff wrong. I've probably put in like 20 or 30 hours on this boss since I started back at it, and it still is really tough for me to get consistently sub 120 kills, even if I do get, the odd really fast kill and mostly decent kills. It's just really easy for one little part to go wrong, and then the rest of the phases are a lot more rough. But the good thing is with this bow that it's so strong that even if you mess up quite a lot of stuff, you're still gonna get like a pretty decent kill time. So yeah, that short little 1-minute fight turned into a 30-minute video. So if you did watch the whole thing, I really do appreciate it. And if you liked it, please do leave a like. This video took me quite a long time to make, so I definitely really appreciate that. But yeah, I will see you guys in the next one.